It's time to make some cool bases. That's it, no more intro, let's go. We are kicking off the first base by first flipping it over, spraying the inside of the base well blue before we then apply a thick application of a blue-green wash, giving us a deep water vibe. While this dries, we can make a little base feature. And here we're going for an open-handed arm, and we're going to give this a quick paint. Here we are just going to be doing a quick contrast application, first using a red on the sleeves of the jacket, as well as then coming back in with a black contrast to paint the glove. As I'm sure you can imagine, we are able to swap out this arm to any other sort of appendage, and we can paint it for as long and as much detail as we want. What we're aiming for is essentially the replication of someone that's fallen through a thin sheet of ice and is now struggling through the water, trying to not be swept away or even pull themselves out of the frozen ice water. We can now jump back to the base, and here we are going to be building up our thicker, denser ice sheeting. And for this, what we want to do is take some fine flock, which comes in white, and then we want to also take some resin. Here we're using 2-part epoxy resin. Mixing the resin together first, we can then come in and slowly add the flock to the mix. The resin will generally soak into the softer flock, and when we are finished mixing this together, giving us a semi-textured slurry. This slurry can then be added to the base, and we're aiming to essentially make a ring of ice around this base so that we have a hollow in the center, and we're going to be using this white area to represent the area of stronger ice. There's a couple of things here that we probably should touch off. First off, we're using 2-part resin that takes 24 hours to cure. I would not recommend doing that in any way, shape or form. If you can get hold of it, use UV cure resin and cure it with a UV torch. That's going to expedite the process a lot quicker, and then you don't have to wait multiple days for one base as we have in this video. The only reason we're using 2-part resin is I don't have any UV resin at hand at the moment. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on was the ratio of our resin to our flock, and unfortunately I do it basically by eye and by feeling. What we can do is mix in the resin first, and if we're using UV resin, just pour a glob in. Then we can slowly mix in the flock and get up to a desired sort of clumpy textured white slurry. The advantage is that if we apply it to the base and realize that it's a little bit too wet and seeping down and acting more like a liquid than a solid, what we can do is add a little bit more powder to it. Essentially, we want it to be able to be placed and it not shift or sink too much. With our ice slurry sorted, we can now prepare for some of the upcoming steps. First, we're going to need a thin sheet of clear acrylic. This can be roughly cut to the shape of the base, making sure that it is overall bigger than the base so we can cut it to size later. Then, marking out the areas that we've dedicated and built as our deep water versus our thick ice, we can cut out the section in the middle where the water's going to be. This is essentially going to give us a clear plastic ring. At this point, it's important that we don't glue down the plastic donut or plastic ring. Obviously, at this point, we've got a ring that we've cut really jagged holes in, but we need to finish that off. If we're assuming that that jagged hole is where someone's fallen into the ice, that means that there was ice attached to where those jagged points were. And that's what we're recreating by taking a spare sheet of clear plastic acrylic, which is nice and thin, cutting it with a pair of scissors into jagged shapes, and then we've got that to replicate the ice. Now what we're going to do is come in with some resin to glue it all down, as well as replicate a water element as well. The first step here is to mix up some more clear resin, but this time we are not going to be mixing in any of the flock. Rather, we are going to be using this resin as water and as glue. We can do this by taking an applicator and spreading the resin across all of the top surfaces of the ice, giving a nice thin layer of resin that we can use to adhere our clear plastic ring to. We also then need to come in and fill up the center, filling this with the clear resin to the same level as the slurry, helping to replicate that effect of water. This will give us a nice total sticky surface that we can then push our clear sheet of plastic onto. We also earlier talked about a couple smaller offcuts of the clear plastic, and for this project, that's where they come in now. What we're going to do is take these smaller pieces of plastic and then push them into the curing resin at various angles to represent large sections of ice, cracking off and being pulled into the water and replicating that icy lake feeling. Then we need to let this cure before we come back and add our last couple detailed steps. It's worth pointing out that I'm aware that this seems like a lot of work and that you probably haven't subscribed yet. But equally, this one is more aimed at things like characters. Due to the thematic nature of the cracking ice and the hand and everything like that, this is more of a small diorama base suitable for captains, characters, or potential unit leaders. But I know what you're saying. What if I do that, then there's loads of other stuff that I have to do for other bases and it's going to take ages and my army's never going to be done. But don't worry, we're going to be finishing off this base in 2 seconds. But once we've finished that off, we're going to be jumping across to another style of ice base, which is perfect for your units and armies. After a day, the resin should be fully cured, and we can proceed to trim away any excess plastic sheeting around the rim of the base. I tend to lean on the basis of applying an oversized sheet, covering the whole area and then trimming it down to size afterwards. This allows us to get a nice clean edge, and then we can apply our last layer of effects. And this is where we're going to, once again, mix up a thick white slurry, similar to before, tapping a small amount of this onto the base and spreading it across with an applicator. We are aiming to get more around the edges and rim of the base than we are in the center, so it looks like the ice has thinned out near the cracked area. If a little bit of the slurry gets too close to the center or potentially a bit falls in, don't worry too much. If we need to, we can come in and kind of move this away with a brush that we don't care about massively. But generally, it's just going to look like ice that's slowly spreading back across the area and that it's been slightly longer than the instant moment the person has fallen through. With that all said, we now just need to let that all dry and we can move on to our second style of base. And here we're going to be using a couple of different techniques that you can actually apply in different orders and different methods to create a wide variety of different style bases. For this base, we are not going to be flipping it upside down to make a well like we did the first. Providing we are careful, we can work on the top of the base. First, we're going to be applying a dark blue contrast over the black base. This naturally isn't going to show up much being a dark blue contrast over a black base, but it is going to add that tiny hint of blue in the depths. Once we are dry, what we're going to do is grab some of our resin, either UV or 2-part resin, and apply a very thin coat of this across the entire surface of the base. This will slowly dry, giving us a clear layer above that blue that we've painted on. However, now we need to add some ice feeling. And here we're going to be doing that by adding a mid blue into a bit of a dark purple, with the result of giving us a dark purpley blue tone that can then be stippled or sponged onto the base around the edges, leaving a small clear center ring, similar to how we applied the slurry on the original base. That sort of radius is what we're aiming for here. Again, here we're using 2-part 24-hour cure resin. Really would not suggest doing that. Go and grab some UV resin and apply it and cure it with a torch. It's going to be a lot more efficient, especially if you're using this for units or for armies. Once we've gone through and applied this paint layer though, what we're going to do is take some UV resin and essentially recoat it the same as we did the first time round. We're essentially making a sandwich where we go from our blue contrast, resin, light blue ring, resin. Once that resin is dry, we can then get it back out and carry on. With that recent coat of resin dry, we can then grab the blue that we used in our prior mix. But this time we're going to be foregoing the purple, and we're going to just straight up recreate the stipple effect across the surface of the resin. As we apply stages, we are going to slightly narrow the concentration. So here, our blue layer is going to be slightly thinner from the base rim than our previous stage. Again, we can then come back in with some resin, coat all of the previous work, adding another layer of depth. Taking a white this time after that has dried, we can mix that white into the blue and apply our third round of stippling, pulling towards the edges even more. One more layer of resin can then be applied and left to dry, at which point we can come in with our final steps. And here we can kind of go one of two ways. We've got the option that we're going first, which is if you have things like white flock. And then we're going for the second option, which is if you only have paint. So we're going to be covering both, and naturally you can intermix these if you really want to. If you are wanting to add a little bit of variety in look and texture, we can use flock. And we need to do this while the last layer that we applied is still wet and curing. What we want to do is lightly sprinkle some of the white powder on top of the edges and rims of the base and resin while it is curing. This will stick to the top and start to look like an extended frost on the surface. Once we have a light dusting, we can then leave it to dry and cure fully. On the other hand, if you want to go the pure paint method, we have an outcome where what we need to do is take our blue and white mix and then mix these together where the ratio is roughly 90% white with just a touch of blue. This will give us a very, very light blue-white tone, which can be used to light the stipple across the base, lightly catching the centers if we need to give that sense of creeping frost. Now in this video, we essentially covered, I guess, 3 styles of bases, but it was actually 2 with one of them having multiple variations. But essentially, the techniques and methods that we use to construct all of these bases can be used interchangeably across the entire army. There's no reason why we can't mix the slurry version with the multiple layered versions. There's no reason why we can't have the multiple layered versions with the cracked ice. It's entirely up to you. We made multiple different versions here. All of these are using the exact same techniques and methods, just in different orders and at different points. And it gives us a load of variety. So you can see that from these photos. Hopefully, these will be easy to make and recreate. And I'd love to see the different combinations you can come up with. Do you prefer having the clumpy, fluffy, resiny, compacted snow effect on the top? Do you prefer the glossy sheet effect from the multiple layers of resin? All of these are really nice ways of getting thematic ice bases that look nice and chilly, as well as having a nice sense of depth. So there we have it, a bunch of ice bases that are really quick to make and give us a lot of variation. Naturally, if we've got an army of space wolves marching across a planet of ice, their ice may not be consistent all the way through. So we want a little bit of variety, but keeping the similarity. And all of these techniques can be mixed and matched to get a really nice outcome. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a ice-themed model that I can link to. Anything like Space Wolves we may do in the future. But until then, why not check out the Canadian Combat Patrol? Obviously, it's a combat patrol, it's Astra Militarum, but it's based on Canada, or it's themed on Canada. And as we know, Canada gets cold and snowy. So perfect. You could, if you do the Canada Army, use the bases as well for that. Otherwise, if you don't have time for that, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.